Okay, listen up, America. I'm going to explain in 60 seconds why the federal personal income tax is a complete and total fraud. It's a complete and total fraud because if you allege the tax is based in an authority founded in the 16th Amendment, then it has to be voluntary because there is no enabling enforcement clause in the amendment to authorize Congress to write law to enforce a new power created under the amendment. And if it's alleged to be a tax based in the Article 1 taxing powers, then there is no law because the impost, duty, and excise taxing powers don't reach the labor of Americans with legal effect as a tax. This is why for 100 years the two myths have persisted. It's voluntary, there is no law. It depends where you start. If you claim it's the 16th Amendment, it's voluntary. If you claim it's Article 1, there is no law. Now, why is there no law? It's because Article 1 authorizes the power to tax by impost, duty, and excises. Duties tax exported goods. They don't tax labor. We have duty-free shops at the airports behind the security checkpoint of the international terminals. Because to get through the security checkpoint at the international terminal, you have to have a ticket to leave the country. And since you're leaving the country, you can buy all the goods at the duty-free shop free of all American taxes because you're free to take the goods out of the country to consume or resell. So we don't have really any duties in this country because we don't have any natural goods or natural resource shortages where we need to keep them in the country, so Congress is punishing the exporting of the goods. We reward our manufacturers for selling into overseas markets. So duty is exported goods, it doesn't apply to labor. Impost is the power to tax foreign persons, foreign activity, foreign imports, and in foreign places, like the territories and possessions of the United States, which are foreign to the 50 states united. Foreign persons and their labor can be taxed under an impost. And in fact, that's how the original income tax was imposed, as a tariff act enacting an impost to be collected from the labors of foreign non-resident alien persons and foreign corporations. So imposts don't reach the labor of the American people with legal effect. Duties don't reach labor with any legal effect as a tax, and that leaves us with excise. Excise is the power to tax the manufacture, consumption, and sale of commodities within the country, to tax licenses to pursue certain occupations, and to tax the corporate privilege, where it is the privilege of incorporation or the license or handling commodities like alcohol, tobacco, or firearms that is the subject of the tax. And income is not the subject of taxation. It is not the object of the tax. It is the yardstick that measures the amount of tax owed on the taxable income derived from the activities that were themselves taxable by some impost, duty, or excise authority or tax imposed by Congress. Without an impost, duty, or excise tax, there is no taxable income for the federal government to tax under Article 1, regardless of how many statutes they write to try and get around these constitutional limitations. The income tax on the corporations is a corporate excise. The personal tax that was enacted in 1913 is an impost. One's an impost, one's an excise. Neither one of those forms reach the American people's labor conducted within the 50 states under a common law right to pursue an occupation without need of any license, privilege, or import, export, or other taxable activities subject to impost, duty, or excise. There's no impost, duty, or excise that applies to labor. In fact, to make sure that the excise taxing power couldn't apply to labor, in the 1930s, when the labor unions were negotiating with Roosevelt for the new system, they saw that they were going to try and tax labor, so they wrote a statute, Title 15, Section 17, that specifically says the labor of a human being is not a commodity or article of commerce. The purpose of that statute was to remove labor from subjectivity to excise taxation, which is the power to tax commodities and articles of commerce. So, This is why the two great myths have persisted for 100 years. If there's no enabling enforcement clause in the 16th Amendment to enforce a new power to tax allegedly, directly, all earnings and without limitation, well, that would be a new power to tax, because previously under Article 1, labor wasn't touched. So if the 16th Amendment creates a new power to tax, then there absolutely has to be an enabling enforcement clause in the amendment to constitutionally authorize Congress to write law, because if the court can't show that Congress is constitutionally authorized to write the law that's been written, the court can't take subject matter jurisdiction to enforce the claims brought to the court by the government. They have to be able to show that a power has been granted, Congress is constitutionally authorized to write law for the power, and that they wrote the law. You can't show a direct power that's been granted. You can't show an enabling enforcement clause that authorizes Congress to write law under the 16th Amendment. And you can't show a direct tax law that was ever written. They wrote a Tariff Act, the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913. That's an impost. There's no power granted to tax directly. There's no authority to write law to enforce that alleged power. And there's no law that's ever been written to tax the labor of the American people directly. And this is what the government has been arguing in court for 65 years, that you owe the tax because of the 16th Amendment, when it's not possible for any law to be written under authority of the amendment. Every single other amendment where it was intended to create a new and enforceable power, that amendment has its own enabling enforcement clause. The 13th, the 14th, the 15th, banning slavery, involuntary servitude, establishing the civil rights and the right to vote of the black populations in the southern states. Those all have their own enabling enforcement clause. And then we have the 16th Amendment with no enabling enforcement clause. It simply says Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on income from whatever source derived, without apportionment and without regard to any census or enumeration. Okay? The word direct isn't there. It's a tax without apportionment. Well, the only form of tax that's allowed without apportionment is indirect taxes. They only have to be uniform. That's impost, duty, and excise under Article 1, and labor isn't included. The government admits labor isn't included in Article 1. That's why they've been telling you for 75 years that you owe the tax because of the 16th Amendment. But it's not possible to argue that the 16th Amendment created a precedent where it was no longer necessary to have an enabling enforcement clause to constitutionally authorize Congress to write law for the new power, because amendments after the 16th also have their own enabling enforcement clause. The 17th Amendment doesn't, because it was an administerial change on the election of senators rather than the appointment by state legislatures. But the 18th and the 19th both have their own enabling enforcement clauses, prohibition and the right to vote for women. The 23rd, the 24th, and the 26th all have their own enabling enforcement clauses. So with all those amendments after the 16th, even into the 1960s, that all have their own enabling enforcement clause authorizing Congress to write law, it's impossible to argue that any new enforceable power was created under the 16th Amendment. So if there is a new power that was allegedly created to tax directly and without limitation, the courts can't help the government enforce the claims because they can't show that Congress is constitutionally authorized to write any law to enforce that power. That's a fatal defect in the subject matter jurisdiction of the court. And what it means is the judges have been stealing your money for 80 years without subject matter jurisdiction or a verifiable, identifiable, establishable power to write law to enforce any tax under the 16th Amendment. The whole thing is a fraud. You want more? Head on over to tax-freedom, taxfreedom.com, and start reading or watch more videos from this channel at Tax Freedom, again with a hyphen. This is Thomas Freed, and that's the bottom line.